Just the thought that I might catch a glimpse of her is overwhelming. I have a mug of her in my room. It says "Herstory in the Making."
I have her sticker on my computer.
And I just ordered tons of merch.
Notorious RBG.
Yes, the notorious
We're here to get
RBG,
my book signed.
I think it's easy to take for granted the position that young women can have in today's society, and that's a lot in thanks to Justice Ginsburg's work.
Who is more disdained or told to go away than an older woman? But here's an older woman who people really want to hear everything that she has to say.
You have said in public many times that the ideal number of women for the Supreme Court of the United States is 9.
Why not? 9 men was a satisfactory number until 1981. But the change in the federal judiciary as a whole has been enormous. It wasn't until Jimmy Carter became president, he looked around at the federal judiciary and he said, "So they all look like me." But that's not how the great United States looks.
When President Carter was elected, he said, "There are almost no women and there are almost no African Americans on the federal bench, and I am determined to change that." Justice Ginsburg and I were two of the people who benefited from that promise. Ruth was nominated in 1980, and we became colleagues on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit.
When I was appointed to the D.C. Circuit, so often people would come up to me and say, "It must be hard for you commuting back and forth to New York," because they couldn't imagine that a man would leave his work to follow his wife.
He had been extraordinarily successful as a practicing lawyer in New York. There were people who would say he was the best tax lawyer in the city of New York, and believe me, that is saying something.
He was okay playing second fiddle. In fact, he made a joke of it always. He would say, "I moved to Washington because my wife got a good job."
How much advice do you give each other?
Marty was the funny one in the family, and she loved it. And you could see the twinkle in her eye when he would do his funny little quips and jokes.
As a general rule, my wife does not give me any advice about cooking, and I do not give her any advice about the law. This seems to work quite well on both sides.
My father was a very outgoing, very fun person, and I think he helped temper some of Mom's seriousness at times, which I think was to everybody's benefit.
We used to keep a book called Mommy Laughed, which had parsimonious entries.
You are giving me constant advice. It starts calling about 7. It's time to come home for dinner. And at 7:30, and somewhere between 7:30 and 9, we generally make it. And the other thing is it's time for you to go to sleep. Those are the daily, that's the daily advice that I get.
Well, it's not that bad advice. You have to eat 1 meal a day and you should go to sleep.
He allowed Ruth to be who she was, that is, a relatively reserved, serious person who focused on her law work and loved doing that. And the relationship was just magnificent to watch.
When Marty was starting out in law practice and eager to make partner, I was responsible for the lion's share of taking care of the home. But when the women's movement came alive and Marty appreciated the importance of the work I was doing, then I became the person whose career came first.
What was she like as a woman?
Exigent.
What do you mean by that?
Do your homework. Clean your room. Don't disappoint us.
Our dear daughter, Jane, all smile, volunteered to the press. She had grown up in a home in which responsibility was equally divided. Her father did the cooking, she explained, and her mother did the thinking.
she really such a horrible cook?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. To this day, I still can't eat swordfish after what she did to it.
Ruth is no longer permitted in the kitchen. This by the demand of our children who have taste.
So much of the shape of America is the work of the U.S. Supreme Court, and so the makeup of that court is one of the enduring legacies of a president who has an opportunity to appoint justices. And tonight, this new president has his first chance to make it a Clinton court.
This president gives a very clear idea of what he wants in this justice.
I really did want to put Governor Cuomo on the court, but he didn't want to do it, so I started looking around.
He kept moving from his favorite person of the week to the next favorite person of the week. And Judge Ginsburg was sort of old to be a nominee. She was in her early 60s. Most people, I think, thought she was out of the running for that reason. And Marty was just not going to accept that.
We're talking about Ruth, and we must remember how shy she was. I can't think of anyone less likely to toot her own horn than Ruth. So Marty had to play the New York Philharmonic.
No question about it. People who observed at the time said, well, Ruth would have been on a list. Maybe she would be 22 or 23. But it was Marty who made her number one. He had a little book of people that he contacted. They were...
He had lots of contacts in the business community, lots of contacts in the legal community, in the academic community, among the women she had helped. And I don't even know all the things he did.
He was so in love with his wife and so respected her as a real giant in the legal profession, he felt it would be an outrage if she wasn't seriously considered.
And look, he wasn't the only one that was campaigning for somebody to be on the court. He had some pretty stiff opposition, but it was her interview that did it.
When I was nominated back in 1993, Senator Biden chaired the committee. The leading Republican member was Orrin Hatch.
Do you have any concerns right now? There are always concerns because these are very important positions. And so there will be a lot of questions asked.
Day 2 of the Ruth Bader Ginsburg confirmation hearings.
Judge Ginsburg did something no recent high court nominee has done. Spoke at length about her support for abortion rights.
It is essential to woman's equality with man, that her choice, that she be the decision maker. This is something central to a woman's life, to her dignity.
She was put on the court by a liberal president as a liberal justice. And that's the way this country works.
I disagree with you on a number of things, and I'm sure you disagree with me. But that isn't the issue, is it? And frankly, I admire you. You've earned the right, in my opinion, to be on the Supreme Court.
She was confirmed 96-3. Now, you would argue it's not as partisan a time as it is now, but it was pretty partisan.
Promising to defend the Constitution, pioneering women's rights advocate Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been sworn in as the second woman on the U.S. Supreme Court bench.
I will well and faithfully discharge
the duties of the office on which I am about to enter.
the duties of the office on which I am about to enter.
So help me God.
So help me God.
It was extremely exciting because this powerful little woman was going on the Supreme Court, and that meant there were going to be two.
During my long tenure here, I was not the most, quote, liberal justice on the court.
From the beginning, I think what she was looking for was to build consensus. Even though Chief Justice Rehnquist and Sandra Day O'Connor were conservative justices, they were still justices with which Ginsburg was able to find common ground.
To start out, I thought you might like to know a little bit about the gentlemen who are surrounding us. These are the first set of Chief Justices of the Supreme Court. John Marshall is the fourth Chief Justice, and what he said was that this Constitution is the highest law of the land. The 14th Amendment has a clause that you all should know about. It says, "And nor shall any state deny to any person the equal protection of the laws." So if Congress passes a law or the president issues an executive order that is in conflict with the Constitution must prevail.
VMI was a 150-year-old all-male military college. It had a tremendous endowment, well-connected alumni, four-star generals. When you came out of VMI, that was something.
The Virginia Military Institute was the last all-male state-supported school in the country. In 157 years of school tradition, has an all-male military academy.
Boys can be troublesome, full of hormones and so forth. I don't mean to make general gender characteristics or generalizations here, but for some young men at that time of their life, they need discipline, and VMI provided that.
Look at the men which stand before you. They represent the essence of VMI.
A female high school student wanted to attend VMI, so she brought a case against Virginia, claiming that the all-male admissions policy violated equal protection. It actually went from the district court to the appellate court before it came up to the Supreme Court. This was an extremely important case for Justice Ginsburg. It was her first women's rights case on the Supreme Court.
The Honorable, the Chief Justice and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States.
I was very much aware of Justice Ginsburg's history with respect to gender, excluding women from an institution. I was very much aware of that. And I was trying to fashion an argument that would penetrate that.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, educators are virtually united that many young men and young women significantly benefit from a single-sex education.
The curiosity is that you're defending single-sex education when Virginia abandoned single-sex education in all schools but one.
There were a number of women's-only schools in Virginia that chose themselves to go to coeducation because of the demands that occurred.
Demands from whom?
The trends that were away from single-sex education.
I was dealing with a very worthy and formidable force at the other side of that bench.
To clarify, you are defending VMI for all males and no public program for women.
The effort is by Virginia is to promote diversity by creating opportunities for people of both sexes.
That was my pitch. As you know, it didn't work.
The opinion of the court in Virginia against the United States will be announced by Justice Ginsburg.
Some women can meet the physical standards VMI imposes on men, are capable of all the activities required of VMI cadets, and would want to attend VMI if they had the chance. This opinion does mark as presumptively invalid a law that denies to women equal opportunity to aspire, achieve, participate in, and contribute to society based on what they can do.
The four-men-only tradition of VMI became history with the arrival of women entering as first-year cadets.
Cadre, take charge of your arrests.
I was in the first class of women. We were here not to break tradition, not to ruin history, but to help grow it. For those 4 years, I worked extremely hard to be the best person that I could be and to represent women as a whole. I wanted to be that person that stood in front of the men and said, I can do it too.
It is most appropriate that we welcome today a member of our nation's highest court and notable example of a citizen with a lifelong dedication to public service, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Welcome to the Virginia Military Institute.
It wasn't just about VMI. It was about the notion that you cannot exclude women just because they're women. You cannot say categorically they can't handle this. It's way beyond VMI, way beyond. And she pulled some of the justices of that court over to see that you start with an assumption that you have got to treat both genders equally.
So you can see many varieties. There are more up on top. Oh, this one was given to me by the University of Hawaii with French lace, and the beads are from the beach. It's a gift from Law Clerk a few terms back, and this is what I use for announcing majority opinion. And this one is for dissenting opinion. Every day before we sit in the court, the first thing we do is we go around the room, each justice shaking hands with every other. We know that collegiality is very important to the effective working of the court. So we better respect each other and even like each other.
She did something I'm not sure I could have done. She made real friendship with Scalia.
They are the leading voices of opposite points of view on the United States Supreme Court.
Why don't you call us the odd couple?
He is a very funny fellow.
She's a very nice person. She likes opera. You know, what's not to like? Except her views of the law, of course.
Justice Scalia, who believes that one should read the Constitution according to its plain language, according to the meanings that were ascribed to those words when those words were enacted.
What you're saying is let's try to figure out the mindset of people back 200 years ago, right?
It isn't the mindset. It's what did the words mean to the people who ratified the Bill of Rights or who ratified the Constitution?
As opposed to what people today think it means.
As opposed to what people today would like.
I see the Constitution as striving for a more perfect union. Who were we the people in 1787? You would not be among we the people. African Americans would not be among the people.
She's this supposed famous liberal. He's this supposed famous conservative. She's Jewish. He's Catholic. She's retiring at times, and he almost never is. And yet, as with many great friendships, there's a chemistry that maybe you can't entirely explain.
What's the most fun thing you've ever done together? Was it being on that elephant in India?
That was a rather bumpy ride.
And some of her feminist friends gave her a hard time because she rode behind me on the elephant.
That's what
I'm not kidding.
It was, the driver explained it was a matter of distribution of weight.
Washington has a reputation as being a hard town to make good friendships. And the Supreme Court itself is a place where your colleagues on any given case are also your adversaries. It was very gratifying to see the two of them together and know that they had their disagreements, but that my father had this just really wonderful friend.
The presidential election is over. George Bush prevails by 1 vote in the Supreme Court. George, this effectively ends the election.
It has ended the election, and Peter, literally one of the closest elections in American history. 600 votes approximately separated Gore and Bush in the state of Florida, and now by 1 vote on the Supreme Court, this election is over. Look at the dissents and the strong language in the dissents. Justice Ginsburg, the court's conclusion that a recount is impractical is a prophecy the court's own judgment will not allow to be tested. Such an untested prophecy
should not decide the presidency of the United States. I dissent.
She was never supposed to be the great dissenter, but that's the course that history took her on. George W. Bush was able to appoint 2 justices. The addition of Samuel Alito and John Roberts on the court pushed it far to the right.
The role of an individual justice can change dramatically as the court changes. With more conservatives joining the bench, she found she had to really exercise her dissenting voice.
Of course, I prefer to be in the majority, but if necessary, I will write separately in dissent.
I went to work one night and someone had left me a note. It had my name and 3 men. We 4 had the exact same job. My pay was 40% less than theirs. The jury found that I had been discriminated against, but of course Goodyear appealed, and then we were notified that we would be heard in the Supreme Court. I looked at the court makeup. That's when Justice Alito had just gone on the bench. Justice Ginsburg at the time was the only female left. Justice Alito read the opinion. He said I was definitely discriminated against, but I had not filed my charge timely, that I waited too late to file my charge.
Justice Ginsburg has filed a dissenting opinion.
The court does not comprehend or is indifferent to the insidious way in which women can be victims of pay discrimination. Congress intended to govern real-world employment practices, and that world is what the court ignores today.
She's hit the nail on the head, because she definitely said they do not know what it's like in the real world.
Today, the ball again lies in Congress's court to correct the error into which the court has fallen.
She was laying down a marker for Congress, and in fact, federal law was changed because of her dissent.
It is fitting that the very first bill that I signed, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Restoration Act, is upholding one of this nation's founding principles, that we are all created equal and each deserve a chance to pursue our own version of happiness.
Ruth and I were in New York City to see the play Proof. And as we walked down the aisle to our seats, what seemed like the entire audience began to applaud. Many stood. Ruth beamed. I beamed too, leaned over and whispered loudly, "I bet you didn't know there's a convention of tax lawyers in town." Without changing her bright smile, Ruth smacked me right in the stomach. I give you this picture because it fairly captures our nearly 50-year happy marriage, during which I have offered up an astonishing number of foolish pronouncements, and Ruth has ignored almost every one.
Well, I think part of the time when he was sick, she was in denial. He just became weaker and weaker, the way people get sick when they're close to dying. But she somehow knew how to turn off those tear ducts in public. She steeled herself for it.
I found this letter next to Marty's bed in the hospital. My dearest Ruth, you are the only person I have loved in my life, setting aside a bit parents and kids and their kids. What a treat it has been to watch you progress to the very top of the legal world. I have admired and loved you almost since the day we first met at Cornell, some 56 years ago. The time has come for me to take leave of life because the loss of quality now simply overwhelms. I hope you will support where I come out, but I understand you may not. I will not love you a jot less.
We met on a blind date in 1950. The truth is, it was a blind date only on Ruth's side. I cheated. I asked a classmate to point her out in advance. Oh, she's really cute, I perceptively noticed. And then after a couple of evenings out, I added, and boy, she's really, really smart. In the intervening 53 years, nothing changed.
It's considered one of the most important pieces of civil rights legislation ever passed. But by 5-4, the U.S. Supreme Court today took the teeth out of a law enacted nearly 50 years ago.
The Voting Rights Act has policed voting discrimination, but today's decision effectively puts it on hold.
Chief Justice John Roberts summarized his opinion in 4 telling words. Our country has changed.
Justice Ginsburg has filed a dissenting opinion.
Race-based voting discrimination still exists. This court's decision is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet.
She called out the majority and said this makes 0 sense. The entire reason that racial discrimination in voting is not happening is because we have this very important law.
I was righteously angry right alongside with her.
Her dissent was the introduction for many young people about how important the court is to our everyday lives. I just pulled up Photoshop and did the design in like 15 minutes.
I came up with a couple of slogans, but the one that kept coming back to me was, "You can't spell truth without Ruth."
A friend of mine posted on Facebook saying, "Wow, Justice Ginsburg sure can write. Hashtag notorious RBG." So I started a Tumblr and I called it Notorious RBG.
She is known to fans the world over as the Notorious RBG.
Yeah, this album is dedicated to all the teachers that told me I never amount to nothing.
People ask me, don't you feel uncomfortable being with a name like the Notorious B.I.G.? And why should I feel uncomfortable? We have a lot in common. First and foremost, we were both born and bred in Brooklyn, New York.
Young people are really craving different kinds of icons. Realizing that somebody like RBG has been doing her job for decades and being forceful and speaking truth to power kind of blows my mind.
A big win for conservatives in the Hobby Lobby case.
Justice Ginsburg has filed a dissenting opinion.
The ability of women to participate equally in the economic and social life of the nation has been facilitated by their ability to control their reproductive lives.
We were all so hungry to hear from Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Every time Justice Ginsburg wrote a dissent, the internet would explode.
Justice Ginsburg has filed a dissenting opinion. Justice Ginsburg has filed a dissenting opinion.
My dissenting opinion, I dissent from today's decision.
You just had to put the words Ruth Bader Ginsburg in dissente, and then it would get shared compulsively.
Here now to comment is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. All right, Justice coming in hot.
I'm ready to rumble, Mayweather-Pacquiao style. I float like a butterfly, I sting like a bee, I clean myself like a fly.
It's so unlike Mom, but I don't think Mom, or an accurate imitation of Mom would be that funny.
You think she watches them?
I don't think she ever has watched television.
Yeah, I'm not sure she knows how to turn on.
No, she watches the news hour while she's working out.
Yeah, but that's at the court.
Yeah.
Right? Does she know how to turn on the television at home?
I don't think so.
Here to explain is Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Is this Saturday Night Live?
I like my men like I like my decisions. 5-4. That's a third-degree Ginsburg.
It's marvelously funny, I think.
Remind you of yourself?
Not one bit. Except for the collar.
What about the State of the Union where you were caught sleeping?
No, I wasn't sleeping. I was giving in to the weight of my glasses.
Watching the State of the Union, and I noticed that her head is drooping a little bit, and she might have dozed off for a minute or two after that happened and called her up and said, Bubby, you were asleep during the State of the Union. You can't do that.
You went to the State of the Union and you fell asleep.
As I often do. The audience, for the most part, is awake because they're bobbing up and down all the time. And we sit there, stone-faced, sober judges, but we're not, at least I wasn't, 100% sober.
She does look vulnerable. She is this tiny little person. And that is somehow in contrast with being the ferocious defender of minorities and women and certain kinds of ideals.
There's always, I think, the concern that can she continue to keep up this pace?
Well, she's now been through 2 different types of cancer without missing a day on the bench.
I had my first cancer bout in 1999, colorectal cancer. 10 years later, I had pancreatic cancer. I think what it has left me is an enhanced appreciation of the joys of being alive.
One thing I want you to do is just grab them and just pull.
Just standing up straight?
Yep, and just pull. Don't lean back. Good. Just pull. Pull.
This is light.
I know. I got a heavier one. Since it's too light, I got a heavier one. Okay. I started treating Justice Ginsburg back in 1999. She had just came out of chemotherapy, and she wanted to build muscle and get stronger. She's like a cyborg. And when I say cyborg, she's like a machine. Lean back. Good. Yep, and pull yourself up. Exactly. Good. And bring your chest down to the ball. 1. Good.
They're real push-ups, right? They're not girl push-ups.
Yeah, they are. Very real, yes.
I've heard that she does 20 push-ups 3 times a week or something. I mean, we can't even get off the floor. We can't even get down to the floor.
That's true. I always feel better, no matter how tired I am. At the end of that hour, I'm ready to go again.
She definitely embodies the larger-than-life nature of the Notorious title more and more as she gets older.
She's become much more public, much more vocal.
Especially in a time where our politics are just so garbage.
Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg spoke fearfully of a Donald Trump presidency.
an unusually candid political outpouring, calling Trump a faker.
Justice Ginsburg made some very, very inappropriate statements toward me.
I was flabbergasted. It surprised me that she would comment in a derogatory way about any candidate for president. It's inappropriate.
It's not just a matter of decorum. It's a matter of her not understanding her constitutional role.
She has just come out and issued an apology.
You released a statement that read, "Judges should avoid commenting on a candidate for public office." But do you really regret the substance of what you said?
I think the wisest course would have been to say nothing.
Is it wrong for Supreme Court justices to occasionally make a mistake? No, they're human beings. And she's a human being, and she apologized for it.
It is quite possible that many executive orders or other things that a president has supported or done are going to come before the Supreme Court. And that now we have a sitting justice indicating that that person has a deep antipathy against the lawmaker.
The notion that I don't comprehend that my job is to interpret the law fairly, that I'm going to vote one way based on who I might have voted for president is just, none of us, even if we wanted to, could be successful if that's the attitude that we had.
You look marvelous. Knowing that we were opening on the Saturday after the election, I wanted somebody who was a Washington insider to play the Duchess of Krakenthorpe.
The best of the House of Krakenthorpe. There are very few operas that have speaking parts, and the Duchess of Krakenthorpe is one such part. So I wrote basically my own lines for the Duchess of Krakenthorpe. The best of the House of Krakenthorpe have open but not empty minds. No surprise then that the most valorous Krakenthorpians have been women. A lady titled Krakenthorpe at all times must conduct herself with dignity and grace. We now request certain essential documents. Have you brought your niece's birth certificate? Ours is a family wildly trumpeted, hence we must take precautions against fraudulent pretenders.